Are you journeying through grief and needing a little extra support, inspiration, healing, and guidance? Join me in turning your losses into gains. Hi, my friend. I'm Tara Accardo, creator of the Losses Become Gains online community, blog, and now podcast. I'm an only child who lost both parents to cancer within 6 months of each other, followed by my sweet fur baby soon after. After all of this, I knew I was meant to do more with what I had been through. And now, that means supporting and empowering grievers just like you. I'm a wife, friend, grieving daughter, writer, course creator, loss advocate turned grief coach, and I'm here to support you and move you through your grief. I want for you to feel like I'm your friend in the grief space and know that whatever you're going through, there's someone out there who just gets it. Few topics are off limits here because grief and loss don't hold back either. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of what all of this means for you, some coping tools, lifestyle topics, and impactful mindset shifts to take you from just surviving to thriving after loss. So grab a cup of your favorite beverage, get comfortable, and show up with an open heart and mind. I'm so glad you're here. Hello, and welcome back to the Losses Become Gains podcast. I am your host, Tara Accardo. Oh man, I am so excited to dig into today's topic with you. Today, we are talking all about anticipatory grief. This is a type of grief that I feel like people don't and really almost can't understand until they go through it. It's a type of grief that stays with us for a really long time as the anticipatory grief is happening, but also even after the loss actually happens. And there is so much to unpack once that loss officially happens. And I wanted to do a recording about this particular kind of grief because, well, for many reasons. Number one, it is a grief that I know well. It's a kind that many, many people have and will experience, particularly if there is, let's say, a prolonged illness or watching a decline of a loved one in some way. But it often isn't talked about or acknowledged nearly enough in terms of how difficult it really is, how profound and deep the effects can be. And sometimes we don't even realize we're going through it until a few months or maybe even like a year or two after. There's no timeline here. And it's a type of loss that I experienced with both of my parents' deaths. And looking back on it now, I actually don't know how I got through it as well as I did some days. More on that coming though. But because this is Losses Become Gains, your gain today is to gain a better understanding of what anticipatory grief is, the effects that it can have on a griever, and ultimately how to cope with it. So let's dig right in by identifying what is anticipatory grief anyway. As you probably gleaned from the context I just mentioned, it usually affects caregivers and family and friends, and more times than not, when I see it, it is that of a decline of a loved one or a friend or whoever this is in your life. It's a type of grief that begins before, sometimes long before even, a person ultimately passes away. The anticipation that can come to the surface as we venture through diagnosis, for example, deteriorating health and that imminent death is truly one of the worst things we could witness, but that also results in one of the most brutal kinds of grief that we could possibly go through. And it's actually sort of wild if you think about it, how humans can even cope with anticipatory grief. Like knowing the fate of someone you care so deeply for, even if we don't know exactly when, we just know that it's going in that direction. And we still have to function every day. When you really think about that, how do we move from one day to the next with that looming? It's kind of crazy, right? And when I say I know this well, I want to just give you a quick example and some context as to why I say that. And if you've listened to this podcast before, or if you're familiar with my story, this will sound familiar, but I'll keep it brief, I promise. And you may or may not know that my mom was diagnosed with esophageal cancer around May or June of 2019, I'd say. And she died by that same December, so December of 2019, roughly 7 or 8 months. While my dad had a 6-year journey with prostate cancer, his more significant decline was about 6 months, and that was right on the heels of my mom's death. In both of these timeframes, there was, chaos of doctors and hospital visits, bouts of pneumonia. Both of them had it at the same time once, which was very scary. And my mom also having to cope with her tracheotomy. New, more limited lifestyles from what they were used to, not having the appetite or the diet that they once did. On my end, it was just watching all of this with there being little to nothing I could do about, these bodies that were failing them. It was absolutely awful, and I felt so helpless. And very alone, especially being an only child. And even though we did have my mom's sister come stay with us for a month or so, I had some emotional support, but really anticipatory grief can feel so, so isolating. But my mom's decline felt different to me than my dad's in some ways, because with my mom, I hadn't been through anything like that before. It was all so scarring on all of us, really. And we were all flying by the seat of our pants in a way. And for a very, very long time, I think I had my head in the clouds about what her fate really was when it sort of got to this more serious point. So let's talk about how anticipatory grief can manifest itself, because truthfully, there are a lot of ways that this type of grief can manifest and come to the surface. But the ones I'll cover here in this episode are, I think at least, some of the most prevalent and impactful ways, and ones that we really need to be aware of. The ways that we probably need to pay the closest attention to and cope with the most intentionally, which is the whole point of this episode today. First and foremost, certainly for me and for many others, anticipatory grief can involve denial. Especially for a usual optimist and a glass half full kind of girl like me, thoughts that things will be okay. Like they just have to be, because why wouldn't they, right? So just as an example of this in my journey, and perhaps you can relate to this, my mom is still, in my eyes, the strongest person I know. She was a true Taurus to the bitter end, and this woman did not know fear. And there was nothing, nothing that could bring her down. She didn't know the word weakness, but whether the person who's in the process of dying is one of the strongest people we know or not, we can still have some semblance of denial that what's happening is really happening. You know what I mean? But because of that, and also because in my case, I had no idea how large the tumor in her esophagus was until later on, there was no wrapping my mind around the severity of it all. I thought she would go through the necessary treatments, we'd all figure it out together as a family, and sure, it might be a rough road, but she would get through it. There was no other way around it. Death simply wasn't an option. It was too soon. This cancer diagnosis didn't feel right. It didn't fit her. And amongst her persona simply not matching a death like that, a fate like that, like I said, she was still young. She was only 62. So young still. And you couldn't convince me of anything else, like that she wasn't going anywhere for most of her decline. Because I had never witnessed anything like this before, I was both painfully unaware and unprepared. I was also in this great denial that anything could possibly go so wrong, like this wrong. I'm not joking. I still had hope, or maybe it was just denial looking back. I don't even know anymore. Within a month or two of her death, if not even a little less than that. A quick other example of denial and what this could look like is with my dad's decline, which began more or less around like March or April of 2020. And for context, he passed away in July of that same year. It honestly still pains me to say this, but to put it simply, I knew what to expect. Like, generally speaking, I mean, I had just been through it with my mom. Now, of course, not in the same way. There were differences in their types of cancer and health issues, and they're different people, right? All the things. Not to put too fine a point on it, I knew what it was like to have a dying parent in front of me. But this did not come right away. In fact, this realization came pretty late. But again, I almost feel like I was in some pretty deep denial there. A part of this was certainly because I didn't actually know his cancer was metastatic until later on. So I didn't actually know how bad it was, technically speaking. But emotionally, I was like, in what world am I about to lose my dad this soon after losing my mom? Like, no freaking way. This is surreal. This is not happening. Like, this is not happening. It wasn't until I came over to their condo where my dad was living alone at the time. Mind you, I had just broken up with my then boyfriend, now husband, probably an hour or two before this, I'm not even kidding, to find my dad almost non-responsive in bed. Anything he said to me made little sense because of the cancer in his brain. He was very dehydrated, so much more. So I called the ambulance for him, and before I knew it, he was in the ICU. And from there, he never came home. But even in the ICU, I don't think I could comprehend the fact that the cancer had spread like it did. I couldn't accept or wrap my head around, this very sweet nurse telling me that he was very depressed and that he was like on his way out, if you will, like he was not getting better. And I knew in the moment things were bad, putting it mildly, of course, but there was still this part of me that was like, no way is this my reality. And denial is one of those things that can come in waves too. Denial can continue to go and come. And for me, even still, it does. There are days where I'll have a moment to myself or a moment where I'm speaking with someone and a wave of denial hits, as do many aspects of grief. It's not just denial, right? And if denial is something you have or you continue to struggle with, please know this. It is completely, entirely normal and rational, even though it can feel a bit irrational sometimes, because there is a safety in that denial. There is a part of us that doesn't want to admit how bad things might be because the outcome, the reality, is far too painful to bear. And like fear, I feel like this is a coping mechanism for our brain that's trying to protect us from getting hurt, at least more hurt than we already are. It's something that is entirely natural to experience, and we often can't help it. So please never feel like it's the wrong thing to think or feel. Your body and your mind is doing all it can to understand what is happening around you, and that takes time. And that's also where denial can play a role. Something else that can manifest during anticipatory grief is stress and anxiety. And this might be around a looming death. This could even be around a divorce, right? Loss doesn't discriminate here. So apply this to whatever is applicable to you. Now, with stress and anxiety, you're probably like, tell me something I don't know, Tara. These are like two of the main things that I'm feeling, because anticipatory death or a loss or whatever, that is very anxiety inducing. That is very stressful. And if that is what you're thinking right now, I would say, I know, but I'm going to touch on this anyway, because we're going to talk about coping mechanisms and what this might look like, and some healthy ones and some unhealthy ones. So bear with me for a moment. Anxiety is an emotion that's characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts and feelings, and physical changes like increased blood pressure, for example. So I once heard this comparison analogy, however you'd like to think of this, from the movie Willy Wonka. once. And if you've seen the movie, you might remember that crazy, ridiculous tunnel that Wonka brings them all into. And they're traveling through this, and Wonka is singing that really creepy song. It starts going faster and faster. There are those absolutely horrible images that flash on the walls. None of it is logical or makes any sense. It's just frightening and confusing. And this maniacal Mr. Wonka, gotta love Gene Wilder though, is just reciting his poem and having a grand old time, right? Anyway, what am I getting at here? I'm saying that this is kind of what anxiety is like. It's a loss of control. It's worst case scenario thinking and imagery, and complete and utter uncertainty. Meanwhile, if you're in this Willy Wonka ride from hell, you're like, get me off this boat now, please, right? I get it if you're there right now. If you are someone who knows anxiety well, and perhaps this has only gotten worse with an impending loss, I want to acknowledge that, and please know, I see you right now. Anxiety is crippling, and it is nothing to mess around with. And it can be very scary. And not being in control of what's happening to a loved one, a beloved loved one, your emotions, your thoughts, it is one of the worst things and the worst feelings we as humans can experience. And we're going to talk about a lot more about this on this podcast and this episode about how to cope with this. But I just want to acknowledge that if you are feeling stress and anxiety that is coming up to the surface with anticipatory grief, this is very normal, but it is one of those things that's very important to get a handle on as well. Another thing that can come to the surface with anticipatory grief is dread. It is another common emotion that a lot of us grievers might feel as we are anticipating a loss. And dread occurs in response to high probability negative events. And if you're watching a loved one, for example, die from cancer, as I did, that probability of them dying increases with time, theoretically. And it increases as this dreaded event, whatever this looks like for you, draws nearer. And, again, I think of my parents as examples here because they both had slower deaths due to their illnesses. And I knew at some point death was coming. This was an event that I dreaded every single day because dread makes an anticipated negative event even worse. We often prefer to get unpleasant things over with quickly or just try and wish them away, even if doing them sooner means it would be more unpleasant, if that makes sense. I know this is not always a rational thought, but hey, this is a human experience, right? And this almost reminds me of someone being on life support, for example, which my grandmother also was at one point as well. Especially if we know they're not getting better, belaboring it is really only going to make it worse, or can feel that way sometimes. But doing it, now or sooner versus waiting could potentially, one could potentially argue is a really unpleasant idea to ponder, right? It's almost like either way you can't win. And dread can look like a lot of different things. And I'll go over some examples here outside of any death-related losses as well. This could be a friendship, a job, what have you. But think about how this might show up in your life as well. Feeling unsure or nervous about financial responsibilities. What could happen to you or the rest of your family upon someone's passing? How children might take the news or how it might affect them long term. Feeling uncertainty around your own future and what this death or loss could mean for you. An impending loss of identity. For example, if I lose my child, am I no longer a mother? If I lose my parents, am I no longer a daughter? If I lose this job, am I still a, whatever, insert your career or job title there. Having to travel or go to certain places without a loved one. Moving into a different or new space or city or country, being in or around different surroundings, maybe outside of needing to travel or move anywhere. This could mean, being in your current space, just without your significant person. I mean, really the list could go on. There is so much that we have to get used to when a loss happens or when one is, about to happen. But I hope at least some of these have resonated with you. Bottom line, dread is an extremely common and natural and often unavoidable thing to feel when we know a loss is coming. Another thing that can come up in anticipatory grief is feeling very lost and very hopeless. And this is probably, I would venture to say, one of the most frequent emotions that grievers have to move through, either through kind of normal grief once the loss happens or anticipatory. So to begin to, quote, find ourselves or our bearings or, feel more hopeful again, this requires us to reorient ourselves physically, emotionally, and even socially. We can feel lost in our own skin half the time. And examples of how this might show up for us could be feeling unsure of what to do next, whether in your own life or a more immediate decision that's in front of you. Feeling unsure about handle a certain situation that's in front of you. For example, this could be a medical decision, deciding on whether to keep something or not. For example, the belongings of a loved one. More on that to come on this podcast, and so much more. Feeling confused, how we even got here. How did we get to this dark place? Like, how is this even happening to us? Feeling confused and lost about why a certain illness or situation or thing could be happening to someone you love. And even feelings of, why me or why them? We're maybe unsure of how to feel because, perhaps because we're feeling so many things at once that it's overwhelming. Hopelessness about never feeling happy or fulfilled again. Hopelessness and mourning a future that you thought you were going to have, but is now ultimately being taken away from you. Hopelessness about never finding another partner or friend after, let's say, the one you've lost or are in the process of losing. Hopelessness or feeling lost about the notion of never being able to communicate or speak to a loved one again once they pass. Hopelessness in terms of feeling powerless and being able to help your loved one or even yourself through this difficult time. Hopelessness around feeling abandoned or having to go it alone in life. This has absolutely been me. We might feel lost and hopeless and uninspired. Hopeless about how you might be viewed or treated with this impending loss. Lost or hopeless about how you might be able to stand up for yourself moving forward, or once you've lost this person or thing, right? So that was a whole bunch of examples. And similar to the last list, this list is really endless here too. And you might be feeling a lot of these at once. And that is super normal and that is super okay. I want you to know that. It's more than okay to worry about these things. It's a very human response to a threat. The threat ultimately being what we're about to lose. So that really begs the question, how do we cope with anticipatory grief? And again, I feel like so many people find this type of support or this conversation or whatever after the fact. So I just want to quickly interrupt myself here and say, if there is anybody in your life, whether it's you or someone else that you know or will ever know at some point going through anticipatory grief, please, if you feel so inclined, to share this episode with them, because this is truly a topic I'm so passionate about and I'm really trying to get out more into the world, because I think it is something that so many people need help with in the moment. So many of us have to cope with this anticipatory grief like after the loss happened, which really just compounds the loss itself and how devastating that in and of itself is. So it's so much pressure. It's so much sadness on all of us. And when it comes to coping with anticipatory grief, it's this gut-wrenching pain and the agony of getting accustomed to a life without them, without, whether it's a death, a divorce, a friendship, a job, whatever this is. The denial, shock, stress, dread, hopeless thoughts, and every emotion that we've talked about so far, and so much more. How do we do this? How do we cope? How do we move through this? Anticipation of having to live and relive all of this is awful. It makes sense that we might be a little anxiety ridden over all of it, right? And anticipatory grief is a really tricky one because it's probably one of the worst to get ourselves out of. I mean, the loss is happening right in front of us, right? And sometimes it's a slow and painful thing. It's not, I say like classic grief where a loss has happened. Sadly, unfortunately, it's done. And now it's that we have to grapple with, right? There's at least some finality to that. But with anticipatory grief, it can feel like a waiting game. It can feel like you're watching a slow crash of the most painful kind that will just not stop. There is a lack of finality or an unknowing of kind of when the other shoe is going to drop that prevents us from being able to cope with this type of grief very effectively. So what do we do then? As someone who not only coaches in this space, but really, more importantly, has been through this too, there's something we must always come back to, I think. And I want to preface this by saying that this is not a concept I need or want you to understand right now, but with due time. Again, we're always planting seeds here. And that concept is we can't live in this anticipatory grief space all the time, at least not 24/7. We cannot live in this space, which I know can feel like a big ask when it's constantly on our mind. Trust me, my parents' health decline was on my mind all the time as it was happening. But let me say this pretty bluntly. Any day could be our last day, and we don't even know it, right? We know this if we're being faced with a loss or have already experienced one. If the reality is that a loss or a death is on the horizon, I want for you to consider turning this anxiety and whatever you're feeling on its head and take your power back. Quick interruption, then we'll get back to the content, but I promise this will be so worth it. I recently discovered help texts, and let me tell you, I so wish this is something I had found when I was first going through the absolute worst parts of my grief. What they provide resonated with me immediately, and I love how personalized you can make it to your specific loss. It's also perfect for friends and family who maybe want to provide some support, but don't always know how. Help Text provides easily accessible grief support via text to not only those who have suffered a loss, but also their support network. So it allows you to add up to 2 people to your account so they can receive helpful messages too. And they even have options for corporations if you're maybe part of a larger business that is looking to better support your employees. Sign up takes less than 5 minutes and you'll receive your first message right away. And because you would be signing up through me, you'll receive my personal discount as well. So you will get 12 months of Help Text for a very special price. When life gets hard, getting support from Help Texts honestly could not be easier. And I am so excited for you to try it out. I've been using it for a while now. And seriously, I am absolutely loving it. Check out the details in the show notes and be sure to use code LBG when you sign up. Now, I'm not just going to leave you hanging here. Let's talk about a few ways that we can do this to the best of our abilities in an incredibly difficult time in our life. Number 1, spend time. If it's a person you're losing or a loved one's health is declining, which again is often the most common situation with anticipatory grief I've seen, spend as much time with that person as possible. I know all too well that the stress of work, school, a family, and countless other things might prevent us from being able to do this fully. Just for some context, when my dad was declining, COVID was rearing its ugly head and I could barely see him. Most days I simply had to call the post-acute facility he was in and was given no other options, which I absolutely hated, but I would do my best with it. And our conversations didn't always last long or even make a lot of sense due to the cancer spreading to his brain. But listen, the effort was there, right? With my mom, it was visiting her at the hospital as much as I possibly could. I had a geriatric dog. I had a boyfriend. I had a job. I had all of these things on my plate still. And I was spread painfully thin. But I did what I could at the time. And that's what I want for you to remember today. If you can just look back on this time in your life and you can say, I did the best I could with what I was equipped with at the time, there will be so much less regret and guilt in your healing journey. And that's all we can really hope for, right? With the complexities of all of this grief. The point is here, when I say that we want to spend time with them, another aspect of this is we have to try and make this less about ourselves and more about them. Give their legacy the light and attention that it deserves. Be so painfully present with them. Remember every inflection in their voice, the marks on their skin, and the warmth of their touch. I remember holding hands with my parents so vividly, even now, because there's no going back and experiencing those again once they're gone, at least not in the same way, right? So soak it all in. You will be so happy that you did. Next is to cope in a healthy way. So let's talk about some quick coping mechanisms for a moment. Anxiety especially can lead to usually one of two coping mechanisms, worry or avoidance. And unfortunately, neither of these strategies are very effective. Worrying and anxiety often go together, but worry is not an emotion. It's the thinking part of anxiety. Worry can often be described as a chain of negative thoughts about bad things that might or will happen in the future. And research actually shows that those of us with a tendency to worry believe that it's helpful for coping, which I thought was really interesting when I first read this. But I have to say, by the way, it is not helpful for coping. I want to make that very clear. And many also believe that it is uncontrollable, which means we don't try to stop worrying and instead try to suppress worrying thoughts, which actually strengthens and reinforces that worry. Do you see how vicious of a cycle that is? So the suggestion here isn't to worry about worry, but it's helpful to recognize that worrying is just simply not a helpful coping mechanism, that we absolutely can learn how to control it, and that rather than suppressing the worry, we need to dig in and address the emotion driving the thinking. Think about this both with anticipatory grief, but really, I invite you to think about this in any other situation in life where worry is consuming you. Next, I want to quickly address avoidance. This is the second coping mechanism for anxiety that people often resort to. This can also apply to that denial and dread that we talked about. And avoidance often involves kind of either not showing up or often spending a lot of energy sort of zigzagging around and away from that thing that already feels like it's consuming us. And I just want to clarify again one more time, this is not a good coping mechanism. This is just one that often comes up. And the reason it's not a good or a healthy one is because avoidance can really hurt us. It can hurt other people, and it can lead to increased and mounting anxiety. To summarize a quote from Dr. Harriet Lerner's book, The Dance of Fear, and this is what I really want you to take away here. People want to feel comfortable. So we may avoid doing or saying the thing that will evoke fear and other difficult emotions. Avoidance ultimately makes you feel less vulnerable in the short run, but it will never make you feel less afraid. I'll say that last sentence one more time. I think that's so important. Avoidance ultimately makes you feel less vulnerable in the short run, in the moment, but it will never make you feel less afraid. I think that is just so beautiful and impactful and so true. A huge part of anxiety, denial, and dread for grievers is this idea that they could go through another major loss. That is a true fear. And I mean the impending one, but then God forbid another one on top of that someday. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little nervous about the day where I lose someone or something else that's near and dear to me. That is a terrifying thing to think about. The thought of losing yet another loved one or something significant could be anxiety inducing to anyone. And that's okay, but it's more than just the loss, right? It's everything that comes along with it, our security, our safety, emotionally, and even physically. I mean, high secondary losses, right? This can all really snowball. And this leads me to my next couple of points. Remember to give yourself grace. On a related note to what I just mentioned, I want to acknowledge how emotionally taxing it could be to be around someone that we know is ultimately dying. Please remember to take care of yourself. I get more into self-care in a moment, but be selfless in remembering that their life is the one that is coming to an end and they need support. This is an opportunity for us to be strong and find that resilience, but I want to clarify, we do not need to be strong and resilient all the time. We can have our moments of weakness. We can let our emotions out. We have to. But what I want to clarify here is be just selfish enough to know when you need a break. Be there for them, but be just selfish enough to know when you need a break, when you need space and time and an outlet to process what is happening and process what is in front of you. Also, talk to someone. I can't stress this enough. Don't burn yourself out and do not burn the candle at both ends as much as you can avoid it. I did this. Please learn from my mistake. I wish I had been more aware of it back then. And we can't go back, so I don't live in that space anymore, but it's just something that I wish I knew. So here I am telling it to you. And I know this can be hard. And in being a difficult thing, that means you need to take care of your heart and your mind. As difficult it is for your loved one to be on a decline, watching that as someone who loves them so fiercely is excruciating. Give yourself permission to take time out and talk to someone. Perhaps someone not even in your inner circle. I would actually recommend that, to be honest. It could be a grief coach such as myself, a therapist, a counselor, what have you, can be such a beneficial outlet for you to talk about what you're thinking and feeling, your fears about their impending death, planning for the future, and figuring out what that looks like. Everything. Right? Use that to your advantage. And I don't want you to feel like if you're planning for the future before they're gone, that that's problematic. We're going to touch more on that in just a moment. But I want to empower you here because there is nothing wrong with that, right? We're the ones that are still here. We're still living. We're going to have to grapple with this now and after they're gone. So that is important. And that is not a slimy, shady thing to do, right? That is a method of keeping our head above water, and I want to empower you to do that. When it comes to anticipatory grief, I also can't stress enough how important it is to take care of yourself and your soul. A really unfortunate comment I've heard when someone is going through anticipatory grief, this kind of piggybacks on what I just said, is you're putting them in the grave already and they're not even dead. I just cannot stand that comment. It is so unfair to put this back on a griever like that. If you're the one grieving and experiencing anticipatory grief right now, maybe you've had this said to you, or you could imagine at least how awful it would be, how awful it would feel to have someone say this to you, especially when that is not the intention. With comments or judgments like that, we often end up holding our broken hearts and our grief in silence. And let me tell you, that is the last method grievers should be using to cope with an impending death. Grievers need compassion. You need compassion, love, support, hugs, cuddles, food made for you maybe, or delivered, because who's being picky here, right? To simply be listened to, validated, seen. I mean, I could go on and on. So without further ado, here are just a few quick self-care recommendations. And in your self-care, make sure you're getting as many of these as you can from somewhere in your life, okay? Some of my favorite ways to practice self-care in a situation like this are a warm bath, maybe with some lavender involved. If you can, avoid being on your phone or watching TV as you do this. Just really close your eyes, breathe, and let out any emotions that come. This could be very painful. I want to warn you. I definitely did this not too long after my dad died, and it was some of the most painful but cathartic experiences of my life, let me tell you. Treat yourself to a massage. And again, this does not have to be at a fancy place. You don't have to go spending a ton of money here. It could just be maybe a local place, but release some of that tension from your body. Also, by the way, you could totally get like a back massager or something from Amazon. I have that too. Think about ways to make this work for you. Practice meditation. Practice ways to relax and calm your mind. Get some hugs or cuddles from a partner or a friend if you're more of a physical touch type of person. Cuddle up with a good book. And I also want to note here on that note, make sure it's a book that inspires you in some way. I really can't recommend that enough. Whether it's maybe a fun fiction that gets your mind off of everything that's happening for a little while, maybe an autobiography of someone you admire, a nonfiction on changing up your mindset. So for example, I loved Untamed by Glennon Doyle. That 100% got me through some very dark times. Just be sure it's something that leaves you feeling better than when you started it. Try and get lots of sleep. And if sleep is difficult right now, make sure you are getting enough exercise each day to help wear yourself out a little bit better. You can consider taking maybe something like melatonin, but please, I am not a doctor. Research this before you do to make sure it's right for you. Practice breathing as you lay down and try and sleep. Make to-do lists. If your mind tends to run at night, that definitely happens to me. Have maybe a notepad you can write down any other thoughts or ideas that are keeping you up, or literally just use your notes app on your phone, right? Journal your thoughts, emotions, and feelings to really get them out, get them on paper. I have a journal prompt for this on my website if you need it. And also, as of the recording of this podcast, a soon-to-be book form of a journal that's coming very soon. More to come. Practice breathing exercises. I have a whole blog post on this subject. I have a free tool on my website if you need some help with this. In many instances, anxiety, stress, and feeling hopeless is due to the anticipation and fear of your future without your loved one. This pain and the absence you might feel, again, is very natural and normal. And I should note, it can happen over and over again, even years after they're gone. Grief is really fun, right? That being said, focusing only on these feelings creates more anxiety. We're living really in the future here. We're really forward thinking. So again, I want to encourage you, bring it back to the present, okay? So to begin wrapping up this episode, I want to share an analogy. This is sort of a funny one, so bear with me on it, but it has a really good point, I promise. So let's say you and a friend are out having a meal at a restaurant, and you soon realize that something is not right. You both feel like garbage all of a sudden, and you've eaten something bad, and let's just say there are some repercussions. I don't need to get all graphic here. Now, your friend immediately excuses themselves from the table. They go and do what they need to do in the bathroom, but you don't want to embarrass yourself or make a scene in public, or at least in the bathroom. So you sit there and you hold it all in, so to speak. We're thinking about this in our emotions here, okay? Meanwhile, your friend comes back to the table. They feel somewhat better. At the same time, you're feeling worse because your friend has let it go and is able to move on. Maybe not continue with that same meal. But the point is, you holding it in could actually have a potentially fatal reaction. Now, I know this is a quirky analogy, but it's the same thing with your grief. Holding it in and not letting it go, not letting it out, not addressing it, not taking care of it, creates more anxiety and more stress, which can create other harmful conditions for you. We don't want that, right? So whether it's anticipatory grief or whether you are in the thick of it after the loss actually happens, this applies. So really, the takeaway from this episode today is this, and I hope you took away many things from this episode today, but this is really at the forefront. Let the pain and the hurt out so that you can make room for the hope, the love, and the gratitude that wants and so desperately needs to enter your life. Yes, even before our loss actually happens, even if it is in the process of happening. Do your best to use the coping tools and self-care methods that I mentioned to do one thing and one thing only. Take it moment by moment, day by day. That's it. Put one foot in front of the other, be there, and be present for your person. Give them your full and undivided attention when you're with them, and do your very best not to think about the weight of the responsibilities that are being dangled in front of you, because you will not get that time back. And trust me, you will have plenty of time to deal with them later, right? It's all about balance. It's being present with them. And then let's say you have to leave them. Maybe they're like in a hospital and you have to go home, for example, after. Then be present at home and find this balance for yourself and allow yourself to be cared for. Take the actions to care for yourself too, because anticipatory grief is too significant to ignore. Okay? Oh, deep breath, because that was a hefty topic. Definitely more to come on this podcast, and I am so excited to share that with you, but I will leave it here for today. Thank you so much for being here with me as always, and for coming in with an open heart and mind. I truly hope what we talked about today resonated with you in some way, and perhaps can shift the way that you view your loss even a little now, or one that has already happened, even with a little bit of time. And if you love what you're hearing on this podcast and feel inclined to leave a review or comment, or again, even share it with someone who could use it, I would appreciate it so much so I can continue bringing even more content to those who need it. I hope you have a beautiful day. Remember to continue thinking about what gains you can find from your losses each and every day, and I will see you in the next episode. I am sending you a huge thank you for tuning into today's episode, my friend. I'm so grateful you're here and for the steps that you're taking to heal your heart, open your mind, fulfill your soul, to learn, grow, and evolve, and move through this crazy thing called life in big, beautiful, impactful ways. Visit lossesbecomegains.com for my blog and for more coping tools. Explore my Grief Becomes Gains online course if you need some extra grief support and coaching. And be sure you're following along on Instagram and Facebook at Losses Become Gains podcast. I love seeing new faces, meeting new people, hearing your story, and supporting you however I can. And remember to always keep asking yourself, how will I turn my losses into gains today? I'll catch you in the next episode.